one very specific question, which you probably won't have the answer for, but if you could just bank it and come back to me, Minister. You know there's been some concern expressed by the South African government about the efficacy of AstraZeneca in terms of the variant in that country. Healthcare workers here working, one or two have contacted me, working with people who are quarantining coming into the country and who may come into contact with that variant, are worried they're being offered the AstraZeneca rather than the Pfizer or Moderna vaccines. So could you come back to me with a response on that as to whether that's a just concern, right? Now, the main point I want to make is this, though, right? The big problem we have in this country and across the world is there's not enough vaccine, okay? What people need to know is a very significant contributory factor to that is the greed of the vaccine producers for profit. And their refusal, as is being demanded by the People's Vaccine Alliance, to share the formulas and the intellectual property that would allow other vaccine producers to produce vaccine in large quantities. Pfizer and Moderna and AstraZeneca, between them, are only planning to produce enough vaccine for 1/3 of the world's population, but actually most of that is being sold to the rich countries. The biggest manufacturers of vaccines in the world are barely producing any, because they can't, either they don't want to, or because they're not being given the mechanisms to do it. According to UNICEF, only 46% of global capacity to produce COVID vaccines is actually being utilised because of these problems around intellectual property. Right? This is a disgrace, an absolute disgrace, and it threatens to undermine the vaccine effort on a global level. We have some of those big vaccine producers, the three biggest in the world, in fact, all have bases in this country and can produce vaccines, but are not producing vaccines. Right? That is an outrage. Now, as you know, Minister, there is a global campaign involving, supported by people like Oxfam, UNICEF and many others, calling for the TRIPS agreement to be suspended at the World Trade Organization meeting, which is on the 10th or 11th of March, which would then allow a very dramatic ramping up of vaccine production. So the question, very simply, I would just like a direct answer. Does the Minister support the People's Vaccine Campaign and will call for the suspension of intellectual property rights and monopolies over the right to produce these vaccines at the WTO meeting?
Well, let's hear Deputy Paul Murphy, and then we'll get the answer for both of you.
My question relates to that, so I'd like to hear the answer,
right,
and then I can
answer then.
Thank you, Deputy. What I can state absolutely is we need a global solution to this for all sorts of reasons. We need it for ethical and moral reasons. And we also need it for reasons of self-interest, because, you know, there's no point Ireland fully vaccinating ourselves. We live in a globalised world, and we need a global solution to this. So, given that we need a global solution for ethical, for moral, and for our own self-interest, what's the right answer to that? Is it for intellectual property to be suspended? Maybe it is. I tell you why I would be worried about that as the solution, though. These pharmaceutical companies, which you rail against, have produced in an unprecedented short period of time an array of vaccines that are highly effective and that we're now using. And if we just go back a few months, eminent experts were telling me that it could be years, if ever, before we get vaccines to COVID-19. Right? And so maybe if this was the only vaccine of its, virus of its type that we were ever going to see, then maybe that could be something. But I'll tell you what my concern would be that if there was a move to say we're suspending intellectual property, the next virus that arrives or the next variant that arrives, those very same companies who we need to produce the vaccines would say, why should we?